The mystery of Mozart's death. Did he sing too much about Freemasonry? A child prodigy in the world of music, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart began singing for Europe's aristocracy and composed his first works at the age of 6. 30 years later, at the height of his career, he died in Vienna under suspicious circumstances. Had he been poisoned? Decades later, Sophie Haibel, Mozart's sister-in-law, still remembered the strange premonition. On the first Sunday of December 1791, he was in the kitchen, preparing a cup of coffee for his mother. The day before he had been to Vienna to visit his brother-in-law who had fallen ill, but he had returned with gratifying news. Now, while she waited for the coffee to boil, Sophie stared pensively at the lighted flame of a gas lamp and thought of her sister's suffering husband, Costanze. Suddenly the flame went out completely, as if it had never been lit, she would later write. There was not even a spark left on the main fuse, and yet not a bit of current had been made, I can swear it. Overcome with a terrible presentiment, she ran to her mother, who advised her to return home to Mozart without delay. Costanze greeted her sister with a sense of relief, telling her that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had had a restless night, and asked her to stay. "Ah, my dear Sophie, I am so glad you have come. You have to stay the night here and see how they die," said the musician. A sudden illness. Always short of money, Mozart had been working at a feverish pace to complete important commissions he had received during the year, and to friends and relatives he seemed strained and exhausted from overwork. But when he fell into bed on November 20th, no one suspected that it could be a fatal illness. The disease began with swelling of the hands and feet and an almost total inability to move. Then came sudden vomiting. Acute malarial fever, this was recorded in the official register of deaths in Vienna. Mozart himself suspected something foul in the middle. A few weeks before he died, the great musician told Costanze that he had been poisoned. "Someone gave me aqua and calculated the exact date I would die. An odorless and slow-acting poison based on arsenic." On December 31, 1791, a Berlin newspaper reported on the composer's death and speculated about its cause. Since his body had swollen after death, it was believed that he had been poisoned, the publication captioned. Incidentally, the older son of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Carl Thomas, remembered that his father's body was so swollen and the smell of putrefaction so strong that no autopsy was done. Unlike most corpses that cool and become inert, Mozart's body remained soft and elastic, like those who died of poisoning. But who would have wanted Mozart dead? The widow did not give credence to rumors of possible poisoning and did not name any suspects. So the story was soon forgotten, only to be revived with dramatic accents 3 decades later by none other than the rival who could very well have wished Mozart the end. Was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart poisoned by a rival? Only 5 years older than Mozart, Antonio Salieri had been appointed composer at the court of Emperor Joseph II in 1774, at the age of only 24. When Mozart arrived in Vienna, 7 years later, the Italian was the most important musician of the Austrian capital, highly appreciated by the aristocracy. But in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, he immediately recognized a rival, a genius whose talent he could never match. For his part, even Mozart did not make a secret of the contempt he had for the composer of the court. Although he always denied any involvement in Mozart's death, in 1823, on his deathbed, Salieri was delirious about his so-called role in this tragic event and wanted to confess his sin. However, there was never any evidence that Salieri killed his rival. Moreover, even the son of the famous composer, who later came to study with Salieri, stated that Salieri had not killed Mozart, but instead, there is no doubt that he had poisoned his life with intrigues. Jealousy of a husband. A second suspect in the alleged murder was Franz Hoftemel, a brother in the Masonic lodge to which the composer belonged, whose young and attractive wife, Magdalena, was among Mozart's last students. A few days after the death of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Hoftemel savagely attacked his pregnant wife, mutilating and disfiguring her with knife blows to the face, neck, and arms, after which he took his own life. Magdalena survived and 5 months later gave birth to a child that bad mouths said was Mozart's. Mozart's older sister, Maria Anna, once remarked that her brother only gave music lessons to young women when he was in love with them. However, from the observations of his contemporaries and from his surviving letters, Mozart seems to have been faithful to Costanze, and there is no evidence of any extramarital affair. Revenge of the Freemasons? In the months after Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's death, there was another rumor circulating. The composer would have been punished by Freemasonry for revealing in the magic flute details forbidden to ordinary people. This allegorical work was a great success with the public, but also with critics. Although some of Mozart's fellow Freemasons may have been taken aback by the magic flute, its composer and librettist Emanuel Schikaneder used the opera to propagate the secret society's ideals of courage, love, and brotherhood to a wider audience. The subject was treated with understanding, respect, and a touch of good humor. The Freemasons in Vienna were not only not offended by the opera, but even commissioned Mozart a cantata, which he composed in a few days between the premiere of the magic flute and the outbreak of the fatal illness. In 1792, the Freemasons in Vienna organized a benefit performance with the cantata for the benefit of the widow and sons of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. A hurried funeral. Since at the time of her husband's death Costanze was financially strapped, she chose the least expensive funeral. On December 7th, the lifeless body was taken to the Cathedral of St. Stephen, where several relatives attended the service in a side chapel. Rain mixed with snow is said to have prevented the procession from accompanying the procession to the cemetery of St. Mark's, half an hour away. Thus, no one was present to note the place where the body was deposited in the anonymous grave. Costanze, who later explained that she had thought the church would take care of placing a cross or a stone at her husband's grave, did not attend to Mozart's grave in any way. Only in 1859 was a funerary monument erected in the St. Mark's Cemetery, its location being completely random. Why did Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart suffer? Mozart's mysterious death and hurried burial have been the subject of intense speculation and debate for 2 centuries. In 1966, a Swiss doctor named Carrie Barr rejected as amateurish and unprofessional the diagnosis of acute miliary fever given at the time. Based on evidence left by Mozart's physician, Dr. Nicholas Clauset, Barr suggested that rheumatic fever, a non-infectious condition characterized by painful inflammation of the joints, was to blame. In 1984, another physician, Peter J. Davies, published an even more documented analysis of Mozart's medical history and his fatal illness. In 1762, the year the 6-year-old musical genius gave his debut concert and began his composing career, Mozart contracted a streptococcal infection of the respiratory system. The effects of such an infection can appear months, even years later. The child later suffered from tonsillitis, typhoid fever, smallpox, bronchitis, and hepatitis A. In 1784, 3 years after his arrival in Vienna, the composer faced a serious illness, with symptoms that included violent vomiting and rheumatic fever inflammatory. Dr. Davies concluded his analysis of the composer's health, concluding that his death had been caused by a combination of streptococcal infection contracted during an epidemic, kidney blockage caused by a hypersensitivity known as Schönlein-Henoch syndrome, a cerebral hemorrhage, and severe bronchopneumonia. Among the side effects of kidney blockage, Dr. Davies noted, are depression, personality disorders, and hallucinations, which may explain Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's morbid belief that he had been poisoned.